Welcome back to Pivot Points. I'm your host, Dave Allen, founder of Brand Pi, the brand consultancy working with businesses to deliver impact at pivotal moments in their journey. Christian Mazzi has lived a life of constant motion, learning to sink or swim from the very start of his life. He moved countries frequently, bringing a cultural awareness and impressive ability to learn and adapt quickly. This superpower is the linchpin of Christian's monumental pivot from the life of a doctor to the high-stakes world of business, where he learned all about energy vampires and how to deal with them. Emotional intelligence bleeds through every part of Christian Mazzi's ethos. So listen close. What follows is the blueprint to crafting a vision that resonates with your teams and your customers alike. Delighted to have Christian Mazzi with me today, and lovely to have you on the podcast, Christian. If you could just spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about yourself, give our listeners a chance to get to know you.
Absolutely, Dave, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with you. So personally, I'm Italian. I was actually born in Johannesburg in South Africa to Italian parents that had immigrated there. And I spent my early lifehood traveling around. In fact, I ended up living in 8 different countries growing up as we traveled the world. And that's something that, in fact, I've continued throughout my life, even as an adult. I've kept moving from one country to the other, kind of gathering that experience and learning different cultures. And today I am living in Boston in the US. It's a recent move, although it's not the first time I live here. But I'm here with my wife and 2 children, 2 teenage daughters. It's a pivot point in its own right, but it's a wonderful place to be. And yeah, that's my personal background. Professionally, I've also had quite a varied journey through life. And in fact, the way I think about it, I've had 3 major chapters professionally. I started my career as a physician, as a medical doctor. I trained and worked in internal medicine. And then at one point, I had one of these proverbial pivot points where I switched from medicine to business. And I went into consulting in healthcare, but consulting nonetheless. It was a big change from the practice of medicine to advising companies on how to operate in the business of medicine. And I did that with Bain & Company, and again, split my time between different countries, but really sort of grew up for about a decade there. It was a great sort of training ground in business. And then I got to a point where I thought I'd had enough training. It was about time to actually get onto it and do the things I was advising to do. And so I made the switch and went into industry. Initially, as it happens with clients, I had the fortune, of course, to have those opportunities. And I joined initially a pharmaceutical company that helped me grow from the traditional sort of country head, chief commercial officer, division president, and then moved into what is today my current role, where CORCYM, about 5 years ago, we launched CORCYM. CORCYM is the company I am CEO of at the moment. And it is the result of a carve-out where we took over a division of a larger company and created an entirely new entity with its own identity, with its own brand, its own future. And that's what I've been doing for the last 4.5, 5 years. And that's where I am today.
Fantastic. And if I go back to your childhood, 8 countries growing up, that must give you a perspective of the world that is immensely valuable. Was it like that, or am I?
It was absolutely like that. I mean, I was very fortunate to be able to experience different cultures, whether it was, like I said, at an early age in Africa, in Europe, in Australia, in the United States. And as you know, the cultures are so diverse and different. But most importantly, the way you communicate, motivate, relate to people is very cultural. And that has made a very significant difference. It's been a very good training ground in retrospect for running a company like CORCYM, where we are in 100 countries, and we have people in many, many different countries with very diverse backgrounds and very different ways of communicating. And so those insights, whether they're implicit or explicit, many of them are implicit, right? I wouldn't be able to write them on a piece of paper, but I can tell you that if I'm sitting in a table with Japanese or Chinese or Italians or French or English or US, it's very different behaviors and ways of relating and communicating and motivating that come to bear.
And that sort of formative period of experiencing different cultures and great diversity, how did that sort of affect your ability to adapt to different environments and just sort of, I don't know how many times you moved every 2 years, but I'm guessing.
Well, we were moving on average every 3 to 4 years.
Yeah.
And I think what it ends up doing to you is it builds a level of resilience in the sort of sink or swim type scenario that you get thrown into.
Yeah.
You have to learn how to swim, and you have to be able to build connections with people. You have to be able to relate to people. You have to be able to learn quick. I think the quick learn is very important and became very useful in environments like consulting, for example, where you might be thrown into a different project you might know nothing about prior to going into it, but you had to very quickly grasp, learn, and adapt. And so, yes, I think that those are the sort of key elements that I've took away from it. It does come with a price, Dave, of course, as you can imagine. I mean, there is value in stability. There is value in having deep relationships that span decades in time, and at times that is somewhat the cost of this sort of life. But I did find ways to cope with it by having those kind of relationships with people who were in my same situation. And so they moved around the world, but we kept in touch. And with today's technologies, that's become even easier. It doesn't matter where they are, we keep in touch. But because we have the very similar background, we have that lasting connection.
Yeah. And what drew you to medicine?
My life at the certainly early stages was kind of driven by what was the most difficult thing somebody could do at any given stage. And it probably is not the right way to go about making decision, but I had a real passion for biology. I had a real passion for understanding biological systems, and medicine was sort of the thing to do. And that's kind of how I pursued it. I absolutely loved medicine. I loved the learning of it. I loved the intellectual challenge of it. I loved the journey I went through. But at one point, I realized that perhaps that was not my calling for the rest of my life. And that's kind of where I sort of made the switch. But to answer your question, the early draw was the the rigor of it and the intellectual challenge behind it.
Yeah. So, I mean, massive pivotal moment to decide. I mean, that must have been a big soul searching decision to leave medicine and do something else. I mean, how on earth did you take that decision?
So it's an interesting one because that was done almost for me in the sense that in medicine, it's a very regimented journey that you go through in the study of medicine and the training of medicine. And I mean, you decide which specialty you're going to pursue, but once you're in it, you're kind of pursuing a very sort of strict set of steps along the way. And I was going through that journey, and I got to sort of that point where I was transitioning to my next chapter of training. And this is a phase of training where you are very much tied to they call it an attending, right? An individual who takes you under their wing and trains you in a specific subject. And I was getting ready to do my next step with a gentleman called Don Baim, a very famous cardiologist, and he sat me down at one point and he said, I don't think you're in it. I don't think you are ready. Why don't you take some time off and come back? And he sort of made me understand that the position would still be there, but at the time, if you're a young guy trying to make your way through this journey and fighting really hard and being really excited about what you got, to be told, hold off for a little while was probably the biggest slap in the face I could have ever gotten by anybody at the time. But credit to him, he kind of had seen that there was something that I needed to explore in order to commit. And so he sort of gave me this year off. And that was a period of time where, I actually said, well, let me go and do something completely different that gives me perspective. And that's when I went to business school. I found a program that allowed me to do it sort of in 1 year time in Paris, and did that. Met my wife there, which is a double benefit.
You owe this gentleman a lot.
Yes, I do. Yeah, he's really sort of had an impact on my life. So look, during that period of time, what was funny is during that period of time, he also made the transition from medicine to business.
Wow.
But yeah, so he was already thinking about making the move. But it was unbeknownst to me, I sort of, on the back of the MBA, kind of saw a world that I was fascinated by,
Yeah.
which was the business of medicine. And I was fascinated by the impact one could have, the decisions one could make, the innovation that sat behind it. And I said, well, I want to learn this. I want to learn this. And that was the pivotal moment when I said, let me not go back right away. I'll do that for a couple of years. And that was, 2002. So it's been a little bit longer than 2 years.
Any regrets or?
Occasionally, I do miss the practice of medicine occasionally, where I do feel like that clinical contact is very important. But I do get that in my current role. It's ironically, as a CEO, you are much closer to the action, like the front line. If you do things right, I think, you're much closer to the front line. So where your customers are practicing medicine, you need to be there occasionally. So I spend more time in the clinic now than I've spent pretty much throughout my career after medicine, if that makes sense. I've spent many years distancing myself from the clinic, and now I'm almost back in there on a regular basis. So I get my regular fix of it, but occasionally there is a bit of a regret. Yes, you can't say no.
Yeah. So you came out with your, I guess, MBA in business. Did you choose to go into consulting at that point? What attracted you to that versus going into a business like you're in today?
Yeah, so I think at the time I thought about the journey I'd been in medicine and sort of said I need a residency training program in business. I mean, I'd read the book.
Yeah.
I had never done any of it.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, let me find a place where I can learn and sort of satisfy my curiosity. And like I said, I wasn't sure that was going to be my sort of path for the rest of my life, but it was a good environment. So I was very lucky to have been there in the right time, right place. And that's where it started. And that's how it started. I sort of stepped into consulting, and like many who do so thought I'd do it for a couple of years, but I ended up spending 11 years at Bain.
Yeah. And so you must have loved that side of the fence and enjoyed it immensely. What were your first impressions of going into the business world away from medicine? How did you adjust?
Yeah, look, the first impact with consulting was, and for many people coming from the sciences, is how can you be making decisions with such little data? How can you make such big decisions without more information? And that was shocking. And in some respects, as a consultant, you are asked to inform or recommend those decisions with the available data. And I never felt like we had enough. But then I very rapidly realized that was exactly what we needed to trade off, was the speed of execution, the decision point, and sort of making sure that the right options had been considered in order to make a recommendation with sufficient precision and data. That took me a long time to figure out what was the right balance. In science, the bar is, the famous 95% confidence interval. We were never going to get that with the data we were looking at, but we were still making big recommendations. That to me took a little while to adjust.
Yeah. Was that where you started to sort of get the desire for leadership, or did that come later?
So that's a good question. I think the desire for leadership came later when you transition, as you know very well, from sort of being an individual contributor to a team member to a team leader, eventually to sort of being a partner and a practice leader. The job changes very dramatically.
Mm.
And the moment in time where I said, well, wait a minute, there's actually a leadership role here was when I was moving from, I think we called it junior partner to sort of not so junior partner, I think it was, but where you sort of are beginning to be more of a mature second, third year partner. And my senior partner was actually thinking of leaving. And so I called it was a little bit of a battlefield promotion. He was leaving, and the question was, what do we do now? Do we bring in somebody else, or do we give Christian a chance? And I think my partners were very generous at the time, and they said, let's see what he can do, and let's support Christian in the journey of. I was very young for a partner to be taking on a practice, but that sort of moment, that battlefield promotion, made me realize that there's a leadership opportunity and learning that was embedded in that, and that's where I really got a taste for it. And I was surprised with myself because I really began to develop a taste and an interest for it. I wasn't doing it particularly well, but I was at least learning very quickly. There was a whole new dimension where you were beginning to make decisions and choices, where you were making trade offs on behalf of others, where you were thinking about 2, 3, 4 steps ahead of what was happening at the moment, something that I'd never been asked to do before.
And, for somebody else taking on their first leadership role, have you got any thoughts, any advice, any guidance to somebody who gets put in that position, particularly if they're in their sort of mid-30s, or it's a very different world, and you have to learn a lot very, very quickly.
Look, these are the lessons I've learned, not only at that sort of moment in time, but later on throughout the journey, was the importance of having that real clarity of communication and having a real sense of transmitting where you're going with something and where you want to go, what your vision is. And that just becomes bigger and bigger as you go from, the vision for that specific project to the vision for that division, for the company, for the industry. But the challenge never changes in the sense that the premium one puts on the ability to transmit that clarity, that unambiguity, is very, very high. And in an environment where, you have people that are very similar to you, have similar background, you have similar upbringing, it's a relatively easy bar. But when you move to a different sort of level, when you have people of very different backgrounds, different cultures, different skill sets, different functions, that premium for clarity becomes very, very high.
Yeah.
Spend time learning that. Don't get frustrated with the fact that you have to repeat something 5,000 times, because that's the way you communicate. That's the way you transmit the message.
Yeah.
And that's what it takes.
And did you find that suddenly the people you sought advice and guidance from changed? Did you have mentors outside of Bain that you used to help you? Because it can get lonely when you get your first leadership role.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yes, you're absolutely right. That was one of the other things that I learned. I'd been told this, of course, that as you move to that leadership role, it becomes lonely, but it really never hits you as hard when you're faced with that situation where people look to you for the first time,
Yeah.
and there's nobody else that you can sort of go and say, well, what do I do now? Well, that's clearly something that happens and you have to deal with. I did develop a series of mentors over the years. I have to say the ones that I've sort of stayed with me throughout my journey, many of them are actually out of the Bain system, only because whether they still there or they left, many of them went through a similar journey that I've been on. Others have stayed within the Bain environment, but they do have that sort of perspective and the culture of, that we have this saying that back then was, a Bainey never lets another Bainey fail. And this is something that I've taken on, in fact, and implemented at CORCYM and others, this sort of concept of, if you ask for help, people should rally and they will rally for you. And I see that. And so the mentorships that I have maintained over time are largely from that environment.
Yeah. And so then you come to another major pivotal moment where you decide to move from consulting, or was the decision made for you? Did an opportunity present itself?
Well, it was a combination of things. In fact, I had gotten to that sort of pivotal point, like you described, where I was beginning to think about what I wanted to learn next, sort of the curiosity behind the next journey. And you mentioned leadership earlier. That I had become very curious about leadership models outside of consulting. And I'd realized that the leadership model in consulting and outside of consulting in an operating company have differences. And I was curious about those differences and how to work in that environment. And so I felt like it was a good time to try that out, to learn that. So it was a combination of the desire to try something new. Opportunities had arisen in, as I'm sure, in as it happens to those in consulting like yourself, there are many opportunities that are presented, but really it was the right time for me to say, let me try something new. And it was driven by this curiosity of a leadership role. And so at the time, there was a mid-sized pharmaceutical company that I had worked for, I want to say a couple of years at that point, and they gave me the opportunity to jump in and take a leadership role. And so I sort of negotiated it with the CEO at the time. Interestingly, it had been set up more of a transition plan, which didn't work out. So if we want to talk about the things that work and don't work out, that's a good chapter. But yeah, that's how it came about, Dave.
No, and how did you find the change from consulting to being in a business that is very different?
It's a difficult transition, and one that is difficult to prepare for, in the sense that you know what you're going into, but until you experience it, you don't really know what it's like. For me, we discussed the concept of communication. That was one of the things that I had to learn very quickly. The other thing that one realizes that you are now managing many people of very different functions, and all of them have more experience and expertise than you do in their particular area. Unlike, in some consulting situations, you will have gone through that journey. So you will have been through the ranks, if you will, and you know what it would have taken to do the job of each individual in the team. In the situation where you're, working in an operating company, very rarely do you have that.
Mm.
You have to manage people from R&D, from quality, from supply chain, from manufacturing. Never done any of those things. That's a big hit. That's something that you have to learn. And knowing how to identify the issues and the things that matter, and being able to probe where in certain areas and not probe into others, or having a dialogue to help somebody in manufacturing come to a decision that aligns with the strategy is difficult. And you have to learn that skill without knowing the discipline, if that makes sense.
I mean, what were the big takeaways from your first sort of like 90 days in that transition period?
Well, like those elements that we discussed, communication, I'd say is probably number one. Knowing how to relate to people of different functions. In the particular 90 days that I was faced with, this was a very unique situation where I was jumping into a crisis moment for that particular company. And in particular, I got thrown into managing a country, interestingly, Italy, for this pharmaceutical company. And that particular division had a crisis, a leadership crisis. So the historical leader wasn't there anymore. The company was a little bit floundering. And there I learned a lesson that I feel like I've been able to take on again and again. It took me a while to crystallize it. So the way I say it now, by no means was it as crystal clear as it is today. But at the time, I realized that I needed to find the nerve or the gene that was going to activate people to do the thing, to really sort of give the discretionary extra effort to the company, to the moment in time. And it wasn't something that you could have found. It wasn't obvious what that would be, but once you found it, and I'll tell you in a second in this particular situation what it was. Once you found it, then you stick to it and you sort of really harness that energy. In this particular situation, if I may, this was a division, the Italian subsidiary of this pharmaceutical company, and it had been operating in a very old school way of doing things, a very hierarchical way of doing things, a very sort of command and control, very functional driven, sort of siloed way of operating. And it had been effective. But what I hadn't realized is that the people in the company, as good as they were, they have this nagging sense of being left behind by the industry. We all saw that the industry was changing. The way pharmaceuticals are marketed, commercialized was changing. There was new techniques of doing things. And the people in this company were feeling that they were being left behind. So it wasn't until I realized that, hey, if we change the way we go to market or the way we present ourselves to the market, the way we communicate to the market, not only does that do well for the company, but you learn a new set of ways of doing things that makes you more valuable and upgrades you as a professional, whether you choose to stay or not, right? That was the insight. And it turned out that this sort of opportunity of reinventing yourself, of upgrading yourself to the current state of the way things are being done was a real motivator, an extremely powerful way of getting people to latch on to the mission and get excited. And so I learned that. So that was a long-winded way to say that's what I learned. I learned that it's one thing to say things and give the big picture, but finding that sort of nerve that will activate people is not obvious. But once you find it, you latch onto it and you go with it.
No, I mean, that in my world is huge because the product portfolio probably didn't change, but you flicked an emotional switch inside the business that just energized everybody. Did that have a surprising impact on the revenue?
Yeah, we went from declining pretty dramatically during the crisis into a growth of 35% overnight for that year. And it was, the fastest growing division in the company. I was able on the back of that to take it was about 150 people or so in the business unit I was managing, and I took them all to Mauritius for a very nice, celebratory event, and that's something they'd never seen before. So, very successful.
Yeah. No, I meet many leaders, and the really successful ones have figured out that it's the emotional switches, not the rational switches, that really get an organization firing on all cylinders. Did that surprise you coming from Bain?
Not at all. I mean, not at the level that, this was the real catalyst for getting things to change. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean,
yeah,
we talk about change management and the importance of the behavioral science behind it, but ultimately, it's all very rational.
Yeah.
It's the emotional component, which I had not been trained on. And that was the biggest lesson learned, and one that took me a while to figure out. And to this day, probably the single most important catalyst for change. You asked me earlier, Dave, what's one of the biggest lessons? The other thing I mentioned was change management becomes a real premium, real deep change management or transformation. And ultimately, that really works if you have the emotional component to make that happen.
Yeah.
That takes a long time for a rational consultant to realize that.
No, I mean, that's phenomenal. And now if I fast forward to doing a carve out, there's nothing more exciting or emotional than doing a carve out of a bigger business. And
yes,
I mean, I can see how all of your experiences and learnings now probably come to one situation where you need them all.
Yeah. So the carve out, that was, you're right, sort of a coalescing of all the experiences, because on two levels. One is we were carving out and creating a new company that was completely independent, but had everything under its roof, right? Every single lever, research, development, commercial, manufacturing, you name it. And that was exciting in its own right. But also, and more importantly, we were carving it out, and this division that we were carving out had 50 years of history. So I like to call it what we created was a startup with 50 years of history, because I was very, very adamant that I wanted to create a new company, but that had the mentality, agility, DNA of a startup whilst preserving the essence of the 50 years of history. That's where it became really, really important to use all the lessons learned to figure out if we are going to move to this new world and change behaviors that are entrenched 30 years, right? 30 years of ways of doing things and had been successful in the past. How do you do that? How do you do that whilst preserving the core knowledge, the behavior, the right, the sort of the essence that you want to preserve? And that was the journey we went through, and we're still going through. But you're right, many of the lessons learned over the years came to fruition during this period.
And how did you give this 50-year-old new business a sense of identity?
Yeah. So we talked about the nerve, hitting the nerve. So what I found out is that there was a real pride in this particular division of the people of what they had achieved in their space. But they had sort of felt that they were part of a bigger boat and they had very little control as to where that boat was headed. Right? So the real catalyst to get people affiliated and linked to the mission was to say, look, we're now going to create our own boat. It's going to be a smaller boat, but it's our own boat. And we are going to be masters of our own destiny. We decide where to go. And we're going to run it in a way where we all decide where that direction, that future direction is. I can tell you more or less where the North Star is, and that's sort of general principle of where we're headed. But how we get there and how we navigate this and the kind of boat that we build, that's something we all have control of. And that was a real sort of energy catalyst, I think, for many of the people who had been there. Not all. That's a very important thing, because what I realize is not everybody necessarily reacts to that immediate sort of degree of freedom and we can do anything we want. Not everybody welcomes it, but those that do really unleash a lot of power.
Yeah. And then you created the name, the identity.
Yep.
There's a nice story behind the name, as I understand it, CORCYM, and you're going to have to tell me about the Arthurian legends of where that comes from, because that's an unusual one.
So the history of the company is that this is a company dedicated to cardiac surgery. It's 100% focused on cardiac surgeon, and specifically the cardiac surgeon of the future. So this is the kind of identity that we created to say, look, cardiac surgery always has to exist. It's going through a period of time of change, but the cardiac surgeon will need to reinvent him or herself, and we're going to be the company at their side, helping them become that cardiac surgeon of the future. And that's a really important thing, because there was a sense of insurgency, right? So built into it to say, we're going to fight the good fight, which is to help the cardiac surgeon, who still has to provide a service for the patient who needs it, reinvent themselves into that surgeon of the future. And that's kind of how we launched the vision and the purpose of the company. The brand, it's an interesting journey. So the name of itself is a name that's a combination of two Latin words, cor, which means heart, and sim, which is short for symbolon, which means valve. So heart valve, that's the core of our business. We create, design, develop heart valves. So if your heart valve degenerates over time, we will be able to develop the products that are either replacing or repairing your heart valves. And so we work with cardiac surgeons to do that and develop those products. But we knew that we had to create a new brand to separate. So the mission number one was to separate ourselves from the previous brand, to create a new identity. But I will say this, at the time, that was kind of it, right? We didn't have much more ambitions for the brand. But at one point we realized, and here, and I know this is not the reason of these podcasts, but it was on the back of one of the thought pieces that Brand Pi had developed around brand value in medtech,
Yeah.
then I sort of said, you know what? There's actually more to do here than just separation from the previous brand. There's some real value to creating this sort of sense of brand that says we are the company that's going to be by your side in this pivotal transition into the new generation of cardiac surgeon, the robotic cardiac surgeon, the endoscopic cardiac surgeon, the cardiac surgeon that uses AI, uses advanced imaging. That's who we're going to be. And we're going to help you through that process and help you reinvent to the customer. And that's beginning to really work, and so much so that we now look at it in the context of who we want to be. And one of the key elements is the value of the brand, because the brand is beginning to gain recognition, is beginning to have a meaning. It's beginning to be played back to us. And I'll give you a quick anecdote. Recently, I had a customer who came back to me and said he was not happy about a post on LinkedIn that we had put. And he said, look, if you want to be the company dedicated to cardiac surgeon, this is what you should be doing. So when the customer begins to play back your brand message and says, this is what you should be doing, it means you're touching something deeper in their psychology, and then you're building that affiliation. And that to me was very rewarding.
Yeah. And that sort of managing your own destiny, that combination of a really powerful, valuable vision, that must have just like switched everybody on.
It did. Although I have to say, not everybody, and this is one of the lessons I learned,
Yeah.
was that not everybody has that gene, if you want to use a metaphor, that you can switch on and off, that will be switched on by that message. And what's remarkable, Dave, is I can never predict, having gone through this a couple of times, I could never predict who's going to be activated and who's not.
Yeah.
You just have to put it out there, do your best, inject as much energy, have as much clarity, and say, this is where we're going, not here, but there. And the people will tell you whether they're on board or not. There's nothing that can tell you whether somebody's going to be, there's no algorithm that says somebody of this tenure, of this role, of this background, of this education, of that education, those are the people you want. No, it's fully distributed. And the only way is to just kind of put it out there and see who reacts and who doesn't. And those that react, you cultivate. Those that do not, you try to activate at some point. If you don't get that activation, it's very hard, I think, to carry people and get that sort of extra discretionary passion and energy unless you get that emotional affiliation, especially through a hard journey.
Interested in your sort of perspective on this, but whenever I'm doing a sort of transformation program, I spend a lot of time going, who are going to be the advocates?
Mm-hmm.
But I spend even more time going, who are going to be the people that everybody go to talk to by the coffee machine and go, what do you think of this? And the semi-terrorists in some sort of way inside the organisation. And we figure out who those people are and try and bring them into the advocate group as part of the setup. Does that resonate or?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I had a colleague that used to call people energy vampires because it's very easy to suck the energy out of a room. It's very easy.
I'm going to use that.
If you try, if you try to build, excitement and energy and focus, and that takes a lot of energy. Taking it out of a room is very easy.
Yeah,
it's very easy, right? And you simply want to control for that. So exactly what you said is identifying those energy vampires, controlling from either getting on them side or controlling for that in some shape or form, because the last thing you want is for people to suck out the energy that you've built, in the room and in the company, which is easy to do.
No, I mean, that's a fantastic thought to sort of start to draw this to a close. I could carry on chatting to you. I just realised we are well into our time slot. And we always finish these conversations with a little bit of an entertaining story. And I know you're a keen aviator, and I'm sure you've got a great story to tell.
Well, yes, this is a story in early in my journey as an aviator. I had just sort of I just finished my training, and of course I was very ambitious to use it as much as I wanted. And I planned a great trip in Australia from north to south and back, and roped in two of my friends to go on the journey with me. And this was flying a small aircraft through Australia, which we did. And we sort of were halfway through when, a big red light went off on the cockpit and said, there's a problem with the plane. Like I said, I was early in my training, and at the time I had no idea what this big red light was.
That's early.
Yeah, it was. And, the funny thing is, at that time, I took out what's the instruction manual, the pilot operating handbook, and started reading it whilst flying the plane, which was not very encouraging for my passengers to see me trying to figure out what it was. And anyhow, long story short, there was a problem with the undercarriage. We flew by the tower. The tower said, "We can't see anything land. We'll have ambulances and fire trucks and whatnot." And this was in a very small, remote location of Queensland in Australia. There's not much happening there. So clearly when that kind of event happens, it's a big deal. Long story, we landed the plane. The plane was fine. It was just a sensor, but it made the local news. It was a big event. It got into the local news. And the moral of the story is, even though it was a very small community, maybe 5,000 people, my passenger's aunt happened to live in this community and pick up that news, which immediately went back to her parents. At the time, I was in medical school at the time. And of course, I had the entire family, friends, village or whatever it is, going kind of sort of looking for me for having put their daughter into danger at the time.
No, gosh. No, I mean, well, I'm glad it was a safe outcome, and that's a great story. I mean, I'd love to thank you for your time today, Christian. Some fantastic insights and some fantastic thoughts that I think the energy vampire is going to probably go global, because we all know
they're out there. They're out there.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for that. That was brilliant.
Dave, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Pivot Points. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more fascinating conversations with industry leaders in our previous episodes. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about Brampai and how we deliver impact in the pivotal moments that matter to you, head over to brampai.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.